people of Harrow Creek, Ontario, called it the old man's folly. That was the polite version, the one they used when Margaret Elton from the post office was within earshot, or when Reverend Tom was crossing the parking lot of the co-op. Behind closed doors, over coffee at the Timberline Diner, the words got less charitable. Bunker, some said. Doomsday hole. A few of the younger men who worked the lumber yards called it something worse. And they laughed the way people laugh when they want the laughter to travel, when they want the person they're laughing at to hear it from a distance and understand exactly what it means. Walter Greer heard it. He always heard it. He had spent 22 years in the United States Army, 2 tours in the Gulf, 1 in Afghanistan, 18 months attached to a Canadian liaison unit operating out of Petawawa. And he had learned in those years to hear things that were not meant to be heard, a kind of listening you couldn't unlearn, even after the uniform came off. Even after you moved north and bought 40 acres outside a small town that didn't know what to do with you. He had come to Harrow Creek 6 years earlier, after his wife passed and his son stopped returning calls with any regularity. He hadn't chosen it the way most people choose a place. He hadn't looked at photographs or driven through on a sunny afternoon and felt something lift in his chest. He had driven north from Waterloo in November, on a gray Tuesday with the heater in his truck rattling on and off. And he had pulled over at a gas station outside Harrow Creek because the rattling had gotten bad enough to worry him, and when he stepped outside and stood in the cold air and looked at the bare tree line and the flat gray sky pressing down on the fields, something in him had quietly decided, this is far enough. He bought the property from an estate sale. The farmhouse needed work. He did the work. The first thing he built, after patching the roof and replacing the windows, was the shelter. He dug it himself over the course of one summer, working through the mornings before the heat settled in. It went 12 feet down and ran beneath the back half of the property, reinforced with poured concrete walls and a ventilation system he had sourced from a supplier in Manitoba. He installed a wood-burning insert with a secondary heat exchanger. He built shelving along the north wall and filled it methodically, preserved food, water filtration, medical supplies, spare fuel canisters, a hand-crank radio, wool blankets sealed in vacuum bags. He ran wiring from the main panel and installed a battery bank that could be charged by a generator, or eventually by the 4 solar panels he mounted on the south-facing slope of the ridge behind the house. He was not afraid. He wanted to be clear about that, though there was no one to be clear with. He had seen what happened when people were not ready. He had seen it in places where the infrastructure had been bombed out, and there was nothing to fall back on. And he had seen it in smaller ways, closer to home. Ice storms that left entire townships without power for 8 days, flooding that caught people with nothing but what they were wearing. Preparation was not fear. It was just mathematics. You looked at the variables, you assessed the likelihood, and you built accordingly. His neighbor to the east, a man named Dennis Hartwell, who ran a contracting business out of his barn, noticed the construction early. He came over one afternoon in July, leaning on the fence that separated their properties, watching Walter haul a wheelbarrow of excavated clay up the ramp he'd built to the surface. "Building a pool?" Dennis asked. "Shelter," Walter said. There was a pause. "Like a, what, bomb shelter?" "Emergency shelter, for extended power outages, flooding, ice events." Dennis looked at him the way people sometimes looked at Walter, a look that moved through several registers in quick succession. Curiosity, skepticism, something close to pity, before landing on a version of politeness. "Huh," he said. "Okay then." By September, the word had spread through Harrow Creek the way words spread in a town of 1,400 people, which is to say completely and with embellishment. The story that made the rounds was that the American who'd bought the Kellerman property was building a bunker. Some people said it was connected to his military service, that he'd seen things that had made him paranoid. Others said he'd told someone at the timberline that he was preparing for a government collapse, which was not true, and which Walt, had he known about it, would have found baffling. A woman who worked at the pharmacy told her sister that he had enough food stored to last a decade. The sister told her book club. The book club told their husbands. The thing that nobody in Harrow Creek knew, because nobody in Harrow Creek had thought to ask, was that Walter Greer had a dog. He had gotten Bear from a rescue in Barrie 2 years after moving to Harrow Creek, after a winter alone that had been harder than he'd expected. Not in any dramatic way, just in the quiet, grinding way that long winters can be hard when there is no one to talk to, and the days are short, and the snow comes, and the fields go silent. He had driven to Barrie on a Thursday in March, and come home with a 3-year-old German shepherd who had been surrendered by a family who'd moved into a condo. The dog had sat in the passenger seat the entire drive home, and looked at Walter with an expression of absolute seriousness, as if he understood that something important was being established between them, and he wanted Walter to know he was paying attention. Walter named him Bear for the way he moved, heavy and deliberate, unhurried in a way that was not laziness, but rather a kind of confidence, as if the dog had calculated that there was no situation in the world worth rushing into. They fell into a routine. Mornings, they walked the perimeter of the property, Bear ranging ahead and doubling back, covering 3 times the ground Walter covered. Evenings, Walter worked on whatever project was underway, and Bear lay on the porch, watching the fields. When Walter went into town for supplies, Bear rode in the truck, and people who had never exchanged more than a nod with Walter would stop on the sidewalk and ask about the dog, and Walter would answer, and sometimes the conversation would stretch into something longer and more human than he expected, and he would drive home thinking that the dog was better at this than he was, and always had been. Winter in Harrow Creek was not gentle. The town sat at an elevation that caught weather coming off Georgian Bay and held it, and the winters Walter had seen since moving there had included cold snaps that dropped to -35, ice storms that bent the cedar trees double, and one December flood when the creek that ran through the low fields behind the co-op had backed up and pushed water into 6 basements on Mapleside Road. People were accustomed to it, in the way that people get accustomed to difficulty, not by solving it but by building their expectations around it, by accepting that certain weeks of the year would be brutal and planning accordingly, or failing to plan accordingly, and managing the aftermath. The autumn of Walter's 6th year in Harrow Creek was warm and long. October held through with temperatures that should have belonged to September, and people moved through the days with a looseness that came from unexpected reprieve. The long-range forecasts said the winter would be mild. Walter looked at the forecasts and went back to the shelter and checked his inventory and added 12 more kilograms of oats and another case of canned salmon and 2 additional wool blankets still in their packaging. Dennis Hartwell saw him loading supplies from his truck one afternoon in late October and called over the fence. "You know they're saying it's going to be an easy winter." "They say that sometimes," Walter said. Dennis grinned. "You ever think you might be overdoing it a little?" Walter considered the question with genuine seriousness, which Dennis had not expected. "No," he said, and carried the crate inside. Dennis told his wife about it at dinner that evening, and his wife told the woman next door, and the woman next door mentioned it at her Tuesday coffee group at the church hall, and the story that circulated was a new version of the old one. The American with the bunker was still at it, still hoarding, still getting ready for an end of the world that wasn't coming. People laughed the fond-ish laugh of a town, laughing at something that no longer surprised them. November arrived and then accelerated. The warmth dropped away in the first week, with a speed that startled people who had let themselves believe the forecasts. By the second week, the temperature had fallen to levels that were normal for January, not November, and the fields were frozen hard, and the creek had a skin of ice along its shallower edges. By the third week, the meteorologists in Toronto were using words like exceptional and anomalous and historic potential, and the local radio station out of Midland was broadcasting advisories 3 times daily. Walter listened to the radio, and he watched the sky, and he felt something settle in him, a quiet recognition. The same feeling he had experienced before operations in the Gulf, when the information coming in from multiple sources began to converge and point in one direction. He brought Bear inside earlier than usual. He made sure the generator was fueled. He checked the vents on the shelter and cleared a path through the snow from the back door of the house. The storm arrived on a Tuesday night in the 3rd week of November. It came out of the northwest with a violence that the forecasts had not fully captured, which is the thing about the worst storms. The models can see them coming, but they cannot always feel them. The wind hit Harrow Creek around 9 in the evening, and within 2 hours the visibility on the main road was down to nothing, and by midnight the snow was coming sideways. And the temperature with the wind chill was -51, and the power was gone. Walter sat in the farmhouse with Bear at his feet and a kerosene lantern on the table, and listened to the wind work at the windows. The farmhouse was old and well built, and he had re-insulated it 2 winters ago, and the wood stove in the main room was throwing good heat. Bear lifted his head occasionally when a particularly strong gust hit the north wall, then put it back down. Walter slept in 2-hour stretches, checking the stove and the ventilation, and the perimeter of the house each time he woke. By morning there was snow above the lower windows on the east side of the house, and the driveway and the road beyond it had disappeared entirely under drifts that reached the tops of the fence posts. On the 2nd day, the temperature dropped further. Walter knew that 3 families lived in the houses within a kilometer of his property. The nearest was the Hartwell place, 200 meters to the east. Beyond that, at the bend in the road, was a couple in their 80s named Poirier, Gilles and Annette, French-Canadian, who kept to themselves and had a small wood pile outside their kitchen door that Walter had noticed last spring was not as large as it should have been. On the far side of the Poiriers, another 200 meters along the road, were the Sayers, Brenda Sayer, alone since her husband had died 2 springs ago, and her teenage granddaughter Emma, who had been staying with her since September, while her parents sorted out a separation in Hamilton. Walter had no way of knowing how any of them were managing. The phones were down. The road was impassable. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, Bear stood up from his place by the stove and went to the front door and stood there, not barking, not scratching, just standing, the way he did when he had made a decision and was waiting for Walter to catch up. Walter put on his gear. It took him 15 minutes. The full layering system, moisture-wicking base, insulating mid-layer, shell with the hood cinched down, goggles over his eyes, face protection, gloves inside mitts. He watched Bear circle back twice to check on him, patient but insistent. They went out into the storm. The cold was a physical thing, not just temperature but pressure, a force that pushed against every exposed inch and found the gaps in every seal. The wind was still high, and the visibility came and went, dropping to near 0 when the gusts came through, and lifting briefly in the seconds between them. Walter moved along the fence line toward the Hartwell property, using the posts as waypoints, Bear ranging ahead and then back. He found Dennis at his back door. Dennis had been trying to get to his woodpile, which was stacked against the outer wall of his barn, 40 feet from the house. He had made it halfway, and then gone down in a drift that came to his chest. He was not hurt, he was cold, and he had lost one of his gloves somewhere in the snow, and the exposed hand was white in a way that needed immediate attention. He was shouting something when Bear reached him, but the wind took the words. Walter got Dennis back to his house first, and then to his own. He sat Dennis next to the wood stove with his hands submerged in cool water, while Dennis's color gradually came back, and Dennis said, several times, with an expression that mixed embarrassment and something more complicated, that he hadn't thought it was going to be this bad. Nobody did, Walter said, though that wasn't exactly true. The next question was the Poiriers. Bear settled that. He went back to the door and stood there again. and Walter understood that the dog had already sorted the order of things, had known before Walter asked that there was more to do. They went back out, continuing past the Hartwell property, moving along the fence line toward the bend in the road. Gilles Poirier met them at his side door, which he had been able to open, because the drift against it was only 3 feet deep. He was wearing his winter coat over his pajamas, and his expression when he saw Walter and Bear emerging from the white was an expression Walter would not forget. Relief moving through an old man's face so fast it looked like grief. Annette was at the kitchen table, wrapped in 2 coats and an afghan, and when Walter came inside, and she felt the heat coming from his clothing, the residual warmth he had brought from his house, she reached out and gripped his forearm with both of her hands, and didn't say anything. The wood stove in their kitchen was still going but barely, and the woodpile beside it was down to 4 pieces. Walter spent an hour at the Poirier place. He got the stove burning properly, and he brought wood in from the supply he'd carried in the pack on his back. He had thought to bring it, and he was glad he had thought to bring it. And he told them to keep the interior doors closed, to keep to the kitchen where the stove was, to not go outside for any reason. There's another storm system behind this one, he told them. 2 more days minimum. Gilles looked at him. And the girl? He said. Emma at Brenda's. We saw her the day before yesterday. She had come over to use the phone. Walter looked at Bear. Bear was already at the door. The Sayer house was at the far end of the road, and the walk to it was the hardest Walter had done in a long time. The drifts between the Poirier property and the road bend had reached a height that required him to push through rather than walk, and the wind on the exposed section of road came from a direction that hit him full in the face, even with the goggles and the face protection. He moved steadily, the way he had learned to move in difficult terrain. Not fast, not fighting the resistance but working with it, conserving heat and energy, keeping his breathing even. Bear went 20 feet ahead and then stopped and turned and waited. Went 20 feet and stopped and turned and waited. The dog was navigating, using the fence posts and the shapes of things buried under snow that Walter could not distinguish from the surrounding white. Walter followed the dog and let himself be led. When they were 50 meters from the Sayer house, Bear stopped and did not move. He stood completely still with his nose forward, and then he turned back toward Walter, and there was something in his face. Not urgency exactly, but the absolute intention of urgency. The face of an animal that has decided something is wrong and is communicating it with everything except language. Walter came up to where the dog was standing. There was a shape in the snow to his right, against the fence line. That should not have been there. Emma was 16 years old, and she had gone out, as far as Walter could piece together later, to try to reach the Poiriers on foot, not knowing Walter had already come from that direction. She had been out for less than 20 minutes, probably. But 20 minutes at -51 wind chill is enough. She was conscious but confused, shivering in the disorganized way. That means the body is losing the fight, and she was wearing a coat that was not made for this. A winter coat that would have been adequate for a normal winter day, which this was not. Walter got her up. Bear pushed against her from the other side, putting his bulk against her hip, anchoring her. They moved back toward the Sayer house, the right direction. It turned out they were closer to it than to the Poiriers, and Brenda Sayer opened the door, and when she saw Emma, her face went through something Walter had to look away from. He stayed at the Sayer house for 2 hours. He got Emma warm and talked Brenda through the signs to watch for, and he checked their fuel situation and their food and left them with what he had carried and told them he would be back in the morning. On the way back, Bear walked beside him. Not ahead, not ranging. Beside him, with his shoulder occasionally pressing against Walter's thigh, the way the dog did at the end of the days when the work was done. The storm ran for 3.5 days. Walter made 2 more runs to each of the 3 households, before the wind finally dropped enough that the roads became passable in a limited way. He brought food from the shelter, carried on his back and in a sled he had kept in the barn for exactly this kind of purpose. He brought extra fuel, extra medical supplies, extra wool blankets. At the Hartwell house, Dennis's wife Karen, who had never spoken more than 10 words to Walter since he'd moved in, stood in her kitchen doorway and looked at him with her arms crossed over her chest, not in the closed-off way, but in the way people hold themselves when they are trying to contain something that might otherwise show too plainly on their face. "You were ready," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Walter said. "You've been ready for 6 years." He didn't answer that. He set down the bag he'd been carrying and began taking things out of it and putting them on her counter, and after a moment Karen came over and helped him. The power came back on a Friday afternoon, 8 days after the storm had begun. The county roads were open by Saturday. On Sunday, Dennis Hartwell drove over in his truck and knocked on Walter's door, and Walter opened it, and Dennis stood on the step in the cold and looked past Walter into the kitchen, where Bear was sitting by the stove. "I owe you," Dennis said. "You don't," Walter said. "My hand." Dennis flexed it, the right one, the one that had been white in the snow. "Doctor said another 10 minutes and we would have been looking at a different outcome." Walter waited. "I told people," Dennis said. "I told people you were being extreme. I said it where you could probably hear it a few times. And I'm not proud of that." He paused. "I wanted to say that." Walter looked at him for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. "I'll make coffee." Dennis came in and sat down at the kitchen table, and Bear put his big head in Dennis's lap without being invited, and Dennis put his hand on the dog's head and was quiet for a moment. The story spread through Harrow Creek, the way stories spread in a town of 1,400 people. But this time it spread differently. Reverend Tom mentioned it from the pulpit, not by name, but clearly enough. Margaret Ellison at the post office told everyone who came in for their mail, and she told it accurately, which was unusual. Someone posted about it in the Harrow Creek community Facebook group, and the comments ran to 300 in 2 days. People saying where they were, saying what they had or hadn't done to prepare, saying things about their neighbors and about second chances. Walter didn't read the Facebook group. He didn't have a Facebook account. He heard about it from Dennis, who read it to him in pieces over coffee one morning, a week after the storm, and Walter listened and didn't say much. And Bear lay on the floor between their chairs with his tail occasionally sweeping the floor. In March, when the ground had softened enough to work, Walter put in a second ventilation shaft on the shelter. He recalibrated the battery bank. He restocked everything he had used and a little more besides, accounting for 4 additional people, and for a duration of 10 days rather than 7. He didn't tell anyone he was doing this. It wasn't a statement or a lesson or a comment on anything. It was just mathematics. You looked at the variables, you adjusted, you built accordingly. Bear watched from the porch, following the movement of Walter's wheelbarrow, up and down the ramp with his amber eyes, patient and present in the way that had become, over 4 years, the background condition of Walter's life. A steadiness he hadn't known to ask for, and couldn't now imagine being without. The town of Harrow Creek moved through that spring, with the particular quality of a community that has been frightened and has come through it, and is not quite back to normal, but is getting there, is trying. People waved to Walter when he drove through. Someone left a bag of apples from the last of their cellar storage on his porch, without leaving a note. The couple from the house on the hill past the Sayerple place, who had never spoken to him, stopped their car when they saw him walking Bear along the road, and the woman rolled down her window and said simply, "Thank you." And Walter nodded, and Bear turned back once to look at the car as it drove away. In June, Emma Sayer came by with her grandmother. She was back in Hamilton by then, but visiting for the summer, and she stood in Walter's driveway looking younger than she had seemed in the snow, which made sense, because in the snow she had seemed very young indeed. She had a card that she had made herself, hand-drawn, with a picture of a German shepherd on the front that looked like Bear in the way that drawings made with care sometimes capture the essential thing, even when the details are imperfect. She gave it to Walter. He opened it and read it. He thanked her. She crouched down and let Bear press his forehead against hers, and the dog's tail moved back and forth in long, unhurried sweeps. After they left, Walter sat on the porch for a long time, with the card in his hand and Bear at his feet, and the June fields going gold in the evening light. And he didn't think about the storm or the logistics or the people who had called his shelter a waste and a foolishness. He thought about his wife, briefly, the way you do when something good happens, and the first instinct is still to turn and tell her. He thought about his son, who had called after news of the storm had reached him, and with whom Walter had spoken for 40 minutes, which was longer than they had spoken in 2 years. The sun went down slowly, the way it does in June in Ontario, going pink and then orange and then a deep fading red at the tree line, and Walter watched it go, and Bear watched it with him, the two of them sitting in the quiet of a place that had become, without Walter quite deciding it, home.